evening, everyone. Welcome to our event tonight with guest speaker Eugene Parta on U.S. global media and American soft power, Cold War successes, current challenges, and uncertain future. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm professor of religion and philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute that is sponsoring tonight's event. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public by exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society. The Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, special thanks go to Shannon Regier, Greg Seams, Molly Work, Carrie Vanderveen, Janine Haydar, and Jeff O'Donnell, students Christoph Hodel and Ann Jensen helping us out tonight. Thanks very much for their hard work, their diligence, their dedication to the Institute and to the college. Our event this evening on U.S. global media and American soft power is the latest event in the Institute's speaker series for fall 2018 on the theme of patriotism, nationalism, and the idea of America. And to introduce our speaker tonight, I invite St. Olaf College professor of Russian and European history, Anna Cuxhausen. Anna?
Mr. Parta graduated from St. Olaf in 1962. While on the Hill, he was a member of the very first Russian language class ever offered at the college, taught by a Latvian refugee from the Soviet Union. After St. Olaf, Mr. Parta went on to study at Harvard and American universities and earned a master's degree at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Since 1969, he's worked in the field of international broadcasting, audience research, serving in various roles, including the Director of Audience Research and Program Evaluation for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague. Mr. Parta has also been active in associated academic fields, contributing presentations and publications on media use, communications, and public opinion in Central and Eastern Europe. In addition, he held fellowships at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University and at the Center for International Studies at MIT. Tonight, he is sharing his expertise and experience with us in a talk entitled U.S. Global Media and American Soft Power, Cold War Successes, Current Challenges, and Uncertain Future. We might hope to hear about some of the obstacles to operating Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Behind the Iron Curtain, the broadcasting provided an alternative source of news and information to that which was offered through state-owned media. The Kremlin objected to its illegal operations, of course. The KGB regularly jammed the signal of Radio Liberty and attempted to make shortwave radios impossible to buy. During the early 1990s, Radio Liberty was granted a license and began to operate legally. Inside Russia today, based on my own anecdotal Russian sources, Radio Liberty has a wide audience, but it is possible to hear mixed opinions about its ultimate purpose. While the contributions of Radio Liberty to the liberal causes of free speech and human rights in Russia are acknowledged, some in Russia are also skeptical about its so-called American agenda. And I am sure the talk we are about to hear will enlighten our thinking about some of these issues. I'd like your help now in welcoming Mr. Parta back to the Hill. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Anna. That was a very kind introduction, and it's great to be back at the Hill. The last time I was here, actually, was to my class reunion last year, and I won't tell you which one that was. The Hill has a very special meaning to me because I actually met my wife here on a blind date. We were tobogganing behind Old Main on Ash Wednesday, and it was very blind because she had a muffler around her face and I couldn't see her. But it didn't end there. My brother Bob followed me here 2 years later, and we had two sons, Rolf and Max, who were at the Parrott College, and a nephew, Justin, who came. So there have been, over the years, 5 Partas at St. Olaf. As was already mentioned, I was a member of the first Russian class with Astrid Ivosk from a Latvian refugee. She was married to the chairman of the German department, Ivar Ivosk, who was an Estonian refugee. They were only 2 of the many refugee professors we had at St. Olaf at that time, and I want to emphasize how important refugees have been to the history of this school. My taking Russian here indirectly led to my career, so I can say that if I hadn't gone to St. Olaf, I probably wouldn't have ended up where I did. I went from here on to the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, continued with Soviet affairs, considered a foreign service career, passed the exam, but I was a policy critic of the Vietnam War at that time. And this also goes back to St. Olaf because I'd done my senior independent study thesis on Vietnam here. So it all goes back to the Hill. But I was comfortable with East-West stuff, which I had gotten into at a very early age. My grandfather was the publisher of the largest Finnish language newspaper outside of Finland. And in the post-war years, he had many guests from Finland, political guests, governmental guests, funneled through the State Department. The State Department would be sending these people across the country. And they would stay at my grandparents' place. And I remembered as a little boy sitting down by the fireplace, hearing these stories about the Winter War with Russia and what was going on between Finland and Russia. So I developed an interest in these topics at a very early age. And then continued with it to New York and a stint with Radio Liberty. I wasn't sure that I was going to stay there, and I was still thinking about a foreign service career, but the Vietnam War was really amping up at that time, and I was offered a chance to go to Munich. So I thought we'd try that, go to Munich. 1966, we were a young family already. Our first son was born in New York. Thought we'd stay for 2 years, ended up staying 47. We lived in Munich, Paris, Prague, and Verbier, Switzerland, all great locations, so no looking back on that. When I arrived in Munich, my first office was in the control tower of what had been Munich's airport before the war at Oberwiesenfeld. This is where, in fact, Chamberlain flew in for the Munich conference. And I could look from I was up in the actual tower there, and I could look out in the field, and all I saw was sheep grazing. I couldn't even imagine Chamberlain. But I shared the office with a Russian Cossack who was a real character. He'd been in 5 different armies on the losing side every time. He had been first in the Russian army in the First World War. Then the Whites came through his area, and they drafted him in. The Whites disbanded, the Reds came to his area, they drafted him in. The Soviet army drafted him at the beginning of the Second World War, ended up in a German prison camp, and then the Germans were recruiting Russians to be in what was the Vlasov army under General Vlasov, who had been one of the leading generals on the Western Front. They never went to war, but at the end of the war, he was in a hospital in Salzburg, and the Russians were being repatriated. He didn't want to go back, so his nurse hid him in the woods. He ended up marrying her. Never learned German, and she never learned Russian. But somehow, somehow they got along, mostly. It seemed when I got to Radio Liberty, everybody there had a story to tell. It was really a colorful place, and as a young fellow, I just drank it all up. I was working in the office of the executive director, but then I went into the audience research side, which was really the eyes and ears of the operation to try to find out what its impact was in the Soviet Union. And my first job there was charged with taking what had been an anecdotal approach to research and trying to structure it so that we could eventually do it in a systematic manner that allowed some certain inferences to be drawn from it. And this was a very challenging task. I won't go into all of the details on that now. I've written about this in another place. but it was a fascinating job. I'm jumping ahead now to the post-Cold War area, where I work closely with scholars from Russia, primarily from the Institute of Sociology, the Academy of Sciences, and the main Russian Public Opinion Research Institute that had been set up in the perestroika time by Gorbachev. I had a fantasy during the Cold War years that, you know, when all of this is over, wouldn't it be fun to sit down over a beer with my opposite number from the other side and talk about what we did? Well, I didn't know that we were going to end up working together. We were colleagues during the entire transformation period, and I got to know many of the leading sociologists of the time. What is sad, though, we probably couldn't have those kinds of connections now. Things have changed that much. So, there is life after St. Olaf, I can say to all of you students who may be wondering about that. It can be abundant. And there are also other oldies who have worked at RFERL. I go back to the early days. Paul Henze and Ralph Walter both played very key roles in the organization. In more recent times, a student of the Russian language department here, Paul Tibbets, is now in Prague. I actually hired him for the job, and there may have been others. I have to admit to a bit of what the French call a déformation professionnelle. I am accustomed to giving very analytical, data-laden talks with a lot of PowerPoint slides that I can point to and walk back and forth and let them do half the talking for me. Unfortunately, I can't do any of that tonight, but for those of you who want to see the charts, the statistics, all of those kinds of things that lend credence to what I'm about to say, I want to recommend two books. One of which I'm the sole author, one of which I'm the co-editor. This one grew out of a conference at Stanford. It's especially interesting because it contains a lot of documents from Eastern European and Soviet archives about their reactions to the broadcast, as well as contributions from people from over there as well. And this book has a lot of the findings and the case studies that I'll be referring to in my talk. So we will now, my talk will be divided into three parts, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. I really don't like, as I said, doing a talk in this way, but if I'm going to get through the material I have, I'm going to have to sort of look at this and then look up at you and look at this and look up at you, but please bear with me. The past success is the story of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America during the Cold War, providing uncensored and factually accurate information to closed societies that contributed to their eventual opening. Relevant lessons will be drawn from this. The present challenge is the weaponization of information by adversaries in a post-factual and technologically complex global media environment, and how U.S. global media responds to this. The immediate future brings a potential institutional threat to the journalistic integrity of U.S. media organizations that historically have been engaged in this effort. This comes at a time of declining U.S. interest in democracy promotion and support for democratic institutions worldwide. So why is this topic relevant today? I'll quote from Jamal Khashoggi in his final op-ed for the Washington Post, published posthumously in October. Quote, "The Arab world is facing its own version of an Iron Curtain, imposed not by external actors, but through domestic forces vying for power. During the Cold War, Radio Free Europe, which grew over the years into a critical institution, played an important role in fostering and sustaining the hope of freedom. Arabs need something similar. The role of Radio Free Europe that Khashoggi refers to will be an important part of this talk. Lessons learned from the U.S. Cold War experience have direct relevance to our present time of global information wars and worldwide retreat from liberal democracy into populist, illiberal democracy." So I'll start off by defining a few terms. What is soft power? If its culture and ideology are attractive, others will more willingly follow, unquote. Soft power is a concept developed by Joseph Nye of Harvard University to describe the ability to attract and co-opt. Using coercion, force, or giving money as a means of persuasion is hard power. Soft power is the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction. Nye put the content of America's soft power into three categories: cultural, ideological, and institutional. In these areas, the world would want to be like the United States. For Nye, the basis of soft power are liberal democratic policies, free market economics, fundamental values such as human rights, in essence, liberalism in the classical sense of the term. However, in the current global context of increasing nationalism and populist illiberalism, has soft power given way to hard power, or another term that Nye developed later on, sharp power, and become less attractive? I'll have more to say on this later in my talk. First of all, let me define Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which will be the focus of the first part of this presentation. This comes from the mission statement of Voice of America, whose role is to represent America to the world. VOA will serve as a consistently reliable and authoritative source of news. VOA news will be accurate, objective, and comprehensive. VOA will represent America, not any single segment of American society. VOA will present the policies of the United States clearly and effectively. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, on the other hand, has a role as a broadcaster to countries with unfree media with a focus on domestic information, not on American information. Quote, this is also from the mission statement. The mission of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is to promote democratic values and institutions by reporting the news in countries where free press is banned by the government or not fully established. Now, VOA's charter remains consistent with the Cold War period and its role of explaining American life and policy to the world. RFERL's has evolved in the post-Cold War era from a former basically anti-communist orientation to a more general support of democracy and free media in unfree or only partially free areas. Both organizations have been under the Broadcasting Board of Governors, a federal agency, which was recently renamed the U.S. Agency for Global Media. I'll have much more to say about this later. They claim 278 million listeners, viewers weekly worldwide to all their networks and media platforms. There are other current U.S. international media networks. We have the Mideast Broadcasting Network, MBN, Radio and TV Marti de Cuba, Radio Free Asia. All are congressional grantees and have a role in the respective regions similar to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So the first part of this talk now, I'm going to segue into talking about the U.S. Cold War broadcasting, mostly to the USSR, but somewhat to Eastern Europe. Now, I'll link myself to previous speakers in this series. Walter Russell Mead spoke of 4 presidential paradigms. U.S. global media has been in a Wilsonian paradigm, in contrast to Mead's Jacksonian paradigm, which tends to avoid outside entanglements until threatened and then fights strongly to crush the foe. Mead sees our current administration as Jacksonian. Wilsonian paradigm, on the other hand, is a values-strong approach which seeks to support the spread of democracy, freedom, and human rights worldwide. I don't know if David Brooks was a Hamiltonian or not, but he certainly raved about the musical. He claims to be an admirer of Edmund Burke, and less so of the current Jacksonian administration. U.S. global media seeks not so much to promote an American model of government to the world, but rather American values: freedom, democracy, free markets, minority rights, human rights, and so forth. This is all in an idealistic Wilsonian tradition. So much for paradigms. What was the Cold War and why was media important? Pardon me if I go back into some of these explanations, but not everybody here grew up with this and knew it as part of their daily life. The Cold War was that state of neither war nor peace, which saw the West, in the form of NATO, and the East, the Communist Warsaw Pact bloc, facing each other in a nuclear standoff. It lasted from about 1947 to 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Some might place it a little bit later. We won't argue that point. The Soviet Union effectively controlled the 5 states of Eastern Europe: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. The governments had complete control of all media throughout the area. While the hard power side of the equation was a military standoff, the hearts and minds struggle, the soft power side of the equation, was carried out by the West mainly in the form of shortwave radio broadcasts. Many of you might not even remember what shortwave radio was, but there was a time when that was one of the main means of communicating across national borders. This was an attempt to break the state's monopoly of information, and thus to help to create the conditions for the possibility of evolutionary change, not revolutionary, within the communist system and its eventual transformation. VOA was founded in 1942 during World War II as a wartime broadcaster to counter German propaganda. Its later role was representing America to the world along with providing general news and information. RFE and RL were founded in the early 1950s. George Kennan, the author of the famous Long Telegram and the Containment Doctrine, was one of the main organizers behind Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. The role of Radio Liberty was a surrogate broadcaster to the Soviet Union. I define surrogacy as a focus on the target country itself, as if it were a free local domestic medium, a free Radio Moscow or a free Pravda. If Pravda could have published like the New York Times does here, that's what Radio Liberty's role would have been. And RFE, Radio Free Europe, was a surrogate broadcaster with the same sense of mission as Radio Liberty had. The two were merged in 1976 to become one organization, RFE-RL. They had been created separately and lived separately until that time, but the individual language services remain distinct. As Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or any other Western broadcaster could not commission surveys within the target broadcast countries, it had to rely on interviewing travelers outside their countries in a systematic fashion through Western survey research institutes. Over a roughly 20-year period, we interviewed over 51,000 Soviet citizens who were outside of their country on their media habits in the context of a study on general media use. It wasn't going out and getting testimonials about listening to foreign radio. It was placed in the context of how they use media overall. Over 100,000 Eastern European citizens were interviewed. I've written about this elsewhere, so I won't go deeply into the methodology now. There isn't time. But there's one interesting anecdote I'd like to share with you. Vladimir Schlappentok had been one of the leading sociologists of the Soviet Union and emigrated to the West in the early 1970s. He became a professor at Michigan State. He was interested in what our operation and had some questions in his mind about how this could actually be done. So we invited him to our office in Paris, gave him free rein. He ran through everything, looked at raw data questionnaires, talked to people, got a general sense of what was going on, spent the entire day at it. At the end of the day, we sat down in my office and he said, well, this has been a most interesting time for me. And I said, why? Because we show that there's a lot of listening to Western radio in the Soviet Union? He said, no, we knew that. That's not news. What is new is that these people are willing to talk to you about it. This is 1985. That means they are no longer afraid. The kind of fear I knew in the early 70s doesn't exist there anymore. This has major implications for how things are going to develop there now under Gorbachev and under Perestroika. And he was right. This interview data that we had, these 50,000 interviews over a 20-year period, were adjusted and projected onto the Soviet population through a mass media computer simulation program developed at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I was there on a visiting basis on a couple of occasions, and we worked very closely with MIT scholars on this. This had originally been developed earlier on for USIA, but they didn't really have much data to put into it. But this was the means of how we were able to take this data, which at first glance would be unrepresentative, but make it so that we could draw some inferences on what was actually happening in the Soviet Union. And as I'll point out later, after the fall of communism, when we were able to go in and study things there, we found out that we were pretty much on the mark. The data showed considerable listening to Western broadcasts, but while audience size itself is not a sufficient measure of impact, it's an important indicator. If you don't have listeners, you can't have much in the way of impact. I'll just run quickly through what the size of the audiences looked like. In the Soviet Union, this is weekly audience reach among the adult population. We're talking about people 16 years and older. Any Western radio station was about 25%. VOA, for most of the Cold War, was the most listened to station there. They were interested in America. Radio Liberty was lower than that. It was heavily jammed during this entire period. However, when jamming was taken off Radio Liberty in November of 1988, it jumped up into first place. It soared. BBC was also a very important broadcaster to the Soviet Union, as was the German station Deutsche Welle. Poland was a different story. Radio Free Europe had a regular audience there of 50%, which hit 80% during the 1970 crisis. Radio Free Europe was jokingly referred to as Warsaw 3, as against Warsaw 1 and Warsaw 2, which were the state stations. Czechoslovakia, Radio Free Europe had a regular audience of about 30%, which spiked to near 60% in 1968. But there's an interesting thing here. At the time of the Prague Spring, when Czech media was opening up, listening to Radio Free Europe actually went down. It was with the invasion of the Warsaw Pact forces that suddenly it spiked because you couldn't find anything useful in Czech media itself. Hungary was around 50% too for Radio Free Europe. Bulgaria was a little bit lower at 30%. And Romania is an interesting case because there was never any jamming of Radio Free Europe in Romania. Its regular audience ran 56 to 60% of the adult population, which shows that it was a real player in the Romanian media scene. A better measure of impact, however, is not the size, but the influence of Western radio on public opinion in the Soviet Union. And there are a number of topical studies that I have in this book that deal with the Afghan War from 1979 to 89, the Samizdat phenomenon. I'll explain what that is. Samizdat was dissident literature or information that was typed privately and passed hand to hand. It was smuggled to the West and rebroadcast back into the Soviet Union, which greatly amplified its reach. Otherwise, it would have been limited to a few dissidents in Moscow. The Korean airliner incident of 1983, when a passenger plane was shot down by a Soviet jet, and how the data that we gathered right after that, the Soviet Union was slow to respond, but it showed that those people who got their information from Western radio had a very different take on what had actually happened than the Soviet media provided. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986, this was the explosion of the nuclear plant, probably the biggest atomic explosion since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the Glasnost and Perestroika period, 1985 to 1960 under Gorbachev, when the Soviet Union was in the process of opening up its media and reforming itself. I'll just take a very, very brief look at Western radio in the Afghan War. We had a study that based on over 6,000 interviews during the 1980s, which showed that Western broadcasts had a significant impact on how Soviet citizens viewed their military action in Afghanistan. Opposition to the war was highly correlated with Western radio listening. It grew gradually during the period among the population, and by the late 1980s, almost half of the Communist Party members were opposed. Not just the population in general, which was much, much higher at that point, but the party itself had begun to change on this. And this loss of popular support contributed to Gorbachev's decision to withdraw. The failed Afghan military adventure contributed to the eventual implosion of the Soviet Union. I have two interesting anecdotes on this. A USIA officer, United States Information Agency, they were allowed to go into the Soviet Union. We were not. He was visiting at the Institute of Sociology at the Academy of Sciences. And right out in the open for everybody to see was a copy of our latest report on Afghanistan. They didn't comment on it. It was just there for him to see, to let him know that, in fact, they were following the work we were doing very closely. Interestingly enough, we were never criticized by the Soviet Union for the work we were doing because, in fact, I think they found it interesting too. It's unfortunate, however, that the topic was so sensitive that the people at the Institute of Sociology couldn't carry out studies like that themselves within the Soviet Union. Another thing that shows how data was used to impact on programming, I was noticing in the individual comments that were coming in on questionnaires that even people who were against the war were starting to object to the way that Radio Liberty was covering the war, talking about Soviet casualties and things of that sort. And they said, look, we don't like the war, but these are our kids, and we don't like to hear about them coming back in zinc coffins. I brought that up with the president of the organization, who was James Buckley, previously a senator and counselor at the State Department, and he said, we've got to do something about this. He called me to Munich from Paris, called in about a dozen programmers from the Russian service and had me discuss this problem with them. They changed their programming approach 180 degrees to show empathy and not schadenfreude. And the reaction to among the audience was very quick to see. So, Western radio is an opinion formation. Is it really formation? Is it reinforcement or change? Well, a study was done. We had good research on this in Eastern Europe, and what it turned out was that reinforcement of existing opinions was the most important thing that the radios were able to do. They were not really able to change opinions very much. They were able to help nurture the formation of opinion. It's hard to change opinions. We look at this country. But reinforcement was a crucial role that the radio was able to play by providing constant information. It's unlikely that results would have been exactly the same in the Soviet Union as in Eastern Europe, where the regime, in Eastern Europe, the regimes had considerably less support from the population. In the Soviet Union, patriotism from the majority tended to identify with, not against the government, and this bonding process had really happened during the Second World War, when the government found its a source of legitimacy. So, opinion formation is a complex process. It obviously does not depend on any single factor. Of course, correlation is not causality, but data indicate Western radio was an important and often a crucial factor in the mix of inputs into an opinion formation, both in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. I'd like to say something about the staff culture at RFERL. I led off with my little anecdote. Programmers were all political refugees from communist countries. Westerners were in management positions, but the chief editors and programmers were former citizens of the broadcast countries, many of them prominent journalists, political or cultural figures, and this was especially true on the RFE side at the outset. It became much more so on the Radio Liberty side with the massive immigration of the 1970s. They could speak with listeners with first-hand knowledge of their situation. To use a journalistic metaphor, Americans were the publishers, but emigre professionals were the journalists. It was not Americans talking to Eastern Europeans or Americans talking to Russians. It was Russians talking to Russians and Eastern Europeans talking to Eastern Europeans. During the 1970s, it was very interesting with this emigration, which was primarily Jewish, not entirely, but primarily, that Radio Liberty, and especially its Paris bureau, became the center of Russian literary culture in exile. Most of the really prominent Russian writers of the time were now in exile and broadcasting their works back into the Soviet Union via Radio Liberty. It became a main programming attraction for the station, especially for the Soviet intelligentsia. And I would say that the cultural programming, especially by people like, these names may not mean anything to you, but Alexander Golich, Andrei Sinyavsky, Viktor Nekrasov, Solzhenitsyn, and others were a kind of new Russian intelligentsia that was given a home in the West. They stayed Russian to the core, absolutely Russian to the core, but their works were broadcast back and had a large following. In fact, many of their books were read at dictation speed so that they could be recorded on cassettes and passed hand to hand. This was called magnetosdoc. An interesting thing about the staff at Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, there was a bill passed in Congress called the Rodino Bill. Peter Rodino was a Democratic congressman from New Jersey in 1967, which allowed RFE and RL stateless refugees to become U.S. citizens by crediting time spent at the radios as equivalent to residence time in the U.S. This was definitely a more generous time than now. If you contrast this with the current difficulty we have in bringing many Iraqis and Afghans into the country who aided the U.S. military, we had a more welcoming spirit. Some observations on the impact of Western broadcasting. They drew large audiences, as had been confirmed by both internal and external data. They were a vital part of the Soviet media scene, reached the better educated and proto-democratic elements at high rates. They were clearly important in the eyes of the regime. The party and government elites were provided printed synopses of the more important broadcasts. These were called white tasks and passed around. They were widely attacked in Soviet media. As Anna has said, heavy jamming was prevalent, especially on Radio Liberty. The BBC estimated the jamming cost the USSR spent over time was more than the West spent on all of their broadcasts. The broadcasters suffered harassment and in some cases were killed. Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian service contributor, was shot in the leg by a ricin-covered pellet shot from an umbrella on a busy London bridge. This is James Bond stuff. A colleague of mine, Rich Cummings, has written a fascinating book on the dangerous history of U.S. Cold War broadcasting, because there were other attacks of this sort, mostly in the early years, but they didn't stop there. And the RFE-RL headquarters in Munich were bombed in 1981 by the terrorist Carlos in the pay of Roman intelligence to the tune of $1 million. So everything wasn't always all quiet and peaceful. Western radio also contributed to keeping Soviet domestic media somewhat more honest in their coverage of events by furnishing alternative information that couldn't be ignored. This alternative information played an essential role in helping to nurture or reinforce democratic attitudes in the Soviet Union and broke the information monopoly which they would have had. I've already mentioned broadcasting the banned literature and all of these back and how it is spread throughout the nation. This was a megaphone effect for a key segment of the population. We tended to underestimate the eventual impact they would have. We called them dissidents. They formed the backbone of the, well, unfortunately, they formed the backbone of the reform movement, but once that was over, they pretty much fell out of fashion and were discarded. It's kind of a sad story at that point. And getting back to the comment that Khashoggi made about the Arab world, Western broadcasters kept the hope of freedom alive for many and helped prepare the way for political change. Why was broadcasting successful, U.S. broadcasting? Credibility was built over time. It was hard to build and easy to lose. The broadcasts had to be confirmed by the daily life experiences of the listeners. Without this experience, if there was some kind of dissonance between what they saw around them and what they heard, there would have been no credibility to the broadcasts. In this sense, the best propaganda is absolutely no propaganda whatsoever. Investment. Influence activities are a long-term game. They require significant investment over time and patience. You can't expect immediate results. There's a lot of pressure right now to so-called move the needle. We want to see something happening right away in terms of some information that's put out. It doesn't happen that way. And Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were able to be credible forces for change in the 70s and 80s because of the significant investment over the previous 20 years when there might have been little to show for their efforts at all. Reinforcement. I've already mentioned this, but external media can reinforce but never create domestic change. There have to be groups within the countries with at least proto-democratic ideas that can be reinforced. Many listeners identified with the broadcaster's goals of greater freedom and democracy that was relevant to their experience. This was especially true in Eastern Europe. Another reason why especially RFE-RL was successful was its distance from official government policies. It did not have to defend or explain U.S. actions. This was not the case with VOA. There was a very artful statement that their broadcasts were not to be inconsistent with the broad outlines of American position, but that gave a tremendous amount of latitude to speak just about anything you wanted to. Another reason was that the audience in the receiving countries was exposed to state monopoly media, and Western radio was the only real competition. Considerable distrust of official media, especially in Eastern Europe. And I think this is an important point. It's perhaps a bit nuanced, but important nonetheless. The radio's message was less promoting free market capitalism versus communism, but rather freedom versus totalitarianism. They didn't seek to promote an American capitalist model which would be little understood. Comparative examples used were more apt to be European, which were closer both to the listeners and to the programmer's actual experience. VOA, on the other hand, was projecting America, but Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were speaking to their audiences as surrogate broadcasters, as if they were free media within the country. And in making comparisons with the West, it wouldn't have been so much with, let's say, American capitalism, but probably more with European social democracy. I don't want to end this part of my talk on too triumphalist a note. The initial success of moving beyond communism in the former USSR and Eastern Europe has not, after an initial period of optimistic flirtation, seen the enduring establishment of liberal democracy throughout the region. Old nationalisms are returning. Look at Russia, Poland, and Hungary. RFE-RL is resuming digital broadcast to Romania and Bulgaria due to the weak media situation there. It never stopped to the former Soviet Union. While these developments are a disappointment, they do not diminish the accomplishment of helping the region to move beyond totalitarian communism. It may take another generation or two for true liberal democracy to take root in the region, although some countries are moving more rapidly than others, for example, the Czech Republic. And it may never happen. I'd like to read a letter from an institute director in Kiev who expressed what Western radio meant to her and to many like her in a letter to Radio Liberty in 1989. Quote, "In my opinion, and I speak for a circle of Ukrainian intellectuals in Kiev, we feel that all the changes taking place in the USSR today are in great part due to Western radio broadcasting the truth, especially Radio Liberty because it devotes so much time to events in the USSR. If the radio stopped broadcasting, we would feel betrayed. It would be disaster," unquote. And a few testimonials from public figures in the East. Václav Havel, former dissident playwright in Czechoslovakia who later became president of the country, quote, "It was not a matter of propaganda, black and white ideological broadcasts. What made Radio Free Europe important were its impartiality, independence, and objectivity." And here's one that I really like. It's from Marcus Wolf, who was the great East German spy master and whose abilities basically undermined many West German governments, including that of Willy Brandt. Quote, "Of all the various means used to influence people against the East during the Cold War, I would count Radio Free Europe and radio in the American sector in Berlin, Rias, as the most effective." Lech Wałęsa, leader of the Solidarity movement in Poland and later president of Poland, asked in 1990 if Radio Free Europe had contributed to the triumph of solidarity in Poland. Wałęsa replied rhetorically, quote, "Is the sun important for the earth?" Boris Yeltsin became president of Russia. That's one side of it. He also gave us Putin. After the coup attempt of August 1991, you remember the the attempt of the KGB and hardline elements within the Russian government to overthrow Gorbachev unsuccessfully. Quote, and during the 3 to 4 days of this coup, Radio Liberty was one of the very few channels through which it was possible to send information to the whole world, and most important to the whole of Russia, because now almost every family in Russia listens to Radio Liberty. I want to note an ironic role played by President Gorbachev. In 1996, the election of 1996, he was sitting in the Radio Liberty studio in Prague. We were given permission to set up a studio in Prague already under Yeltsin, and we had quite a large bureau there at that time. And he was, while Radio Liberty commentators were commenting on the election, Gorbachev was doing the kind of color role for it. Very ironic. The Gorbachev Foundation provided a medium-wave transmitter station to Radio Liberty in Moscow for many years. And at the 50th anniversary party of Radio Liberty, which was held in Moscow in 2003, he was a guest speaker, and had a great time. I'd also like to add one little thing. In 1991, when RFE and RL almost were given up as part of the peace dividend, the Cold War is over, who needs these anymore? And it looked like we might be lined out of the budget. We were asked to contact people that we knew in the East to see if they would put in a good word for the American Congress. And I got in touch with people at the leading Russian at that point, Public Opinion Survey Research Institute, which is now called the Levada Center. You will see references to this. It wasn't called that at that time, but Yuri Levada was already involved with it. And said, could you say something in our behalf? Well, they held a staff meeting to discuss this in a democratic fashion, what they should do. Should they actually do it? And they agreed that it was very important for them to put together a statement that Radio Liberty broadcasts continue to the Soviet, to Russia, because democracy and free and professional media hadn't yet been established there. Current challenges to U.S. broadcasting, and why it will be difficult to replicate Cold War successes. One, you have fragmented audiences worldwide to all media. The new technologies, especially social media, have changed audience media use habits. U.S. global media is attempting to adapt to this environment, showing some success, but it is difficult and it's highly competitive. It's not like a Cold War situation where you're broadcasting in where you only had one competitor, which was not held necessarily in high esteem by its audience. And there's also a problem of the lack of relevant metrics to measure the influence of U.S. media in a world of information noise, unattributed sources, especially in social media. We can measure audience size now, but it's very, very difficult to assess impact of any single media in an extremely complex media environment. Also, the quote-unquote weaponization of information by Russia and its consequences for international communication are significant. The Russian approach of fake news and the relativization of truth is out there to muddle facts so that their aim is not, as it might have been during the communist period, to sell communist ideology to the world, but to muddle the facts in the sense that there is no objective truth at all. The attempt to convey the notion that Russian information is as good as any other source in a fact-free world where everyone is corrupt. They say, okay, we're bad, you're just as bad, there's no difference. It's a cynical approach. We're in a post-truth era. This was the word of the year in 2016 for the Oxford English Dictionary. Toxic is the word for 2018. I wonder why. Russia has concentrated more on information dominance, while the U.S. has concentrated on cyber dominance, which is something quite different. Russia is well ahead of U.S. globally in terms of information dominance. Former CIA and NSA Director Hayden noted that the U.S. isn't playing chess or even checkers in this area, but blackjack, game of chance. There's no longer strong research and analytical support as there was during the Cold War to understand the society with which we are trying to communicate. We have basically given away all of the research capability we had, and it isn't going to be reestablished. During the Cold War, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty had a huge research establishment that followed the press developments in those areas, had about 200 analysts covering the whole of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Interestingly enough, that data that they put together is all now in the archives at the Central European University in Budapest, which had just recently moved its operations to its teaching side, unfortunately, to Vienna, because Orban, who the Hungarian premier, who used to be one of the good guys, is on a campaign against George Soros, who's the funder of the Central European University. And also, I have something here, this book, and they still owe me royalties, so I'm hoping someday I'll be able to collect those. The U.S. has a weak TV presence globally, especially in comparison with adversarial efforts. Everybody else seems to be doing something big in TV. We're doing very little. And U.S. commercial TV is only a partial replacement for a robust USGM effort. And the entertainment aspect of our TV sends very mixed messages about American society and politics. I just read where House of Cards is seen by much of the world now as an example of how U.S. Politics works, where everything is corrupt and if not murderous. Lots of current security issues, increased attacks on RFE-RL journalists, 42 in 2018 in 12 countries. Russia's Justice Ministry has designated RFE-RL's Russian language units as a foreign mass media performing the functions of foreign agent. This is unfortunate, which hampers our operations there. They haven't been closed. I'll give them credit for that. But everybody holds their breath as to when that might happen. This is a response to the U.S. requiring the Russian international TV operation, RT, which used to be Russia Today, to register as a foreign agent in this country. This was well-intentioned act by Congress, but in my view, a mistake. What it did was give the Russians an excuse to move against us in their country, and it doesn't send the right message. If we're for freedom of information, we should allow them to do what we expect to be able to be allowed to do. 3 journalists from RFE-RL's Afghan service were killed in Kabul in April in dual suicide attacks. The Azerbaijani bureau chief was arrested and put in jail. There were regular cyber attacks on the radios, denial of service, almost daily hacking, which our security people are happy to point out is largely unsuccessful. But there are current security issues that are growing on a regular basis. There's also a declining emphasis on U.S. soft power as against military hard power, and this shows in terms of budget. The budget request for 2019 for all of U.S. international media, across the five networks, $661.1 million. This is peanuts. But this is down from 2018 when it was 685, and even more so from 2017 when it was 771. So we have a lot more money now going into military hardware, but a lot less money going into our soft power efforts. Also, the changing U.S. role in the world under the current administration and declining interest in democracy, promotion, and support in human rights, which earlier had been a key raison d'etre for U.S. broadcasting. The idea and practice of democracy is under threat in many parts of the world, and many would say it's currently challenged in the U.S. An example of this is the October issue of The Atlantic, devoted to the theme of Is Democracy Dying? In fact, that was on their black cover, Is Democracy Dying? The Economist Intelligence Unit's annual democracy index in 2017 ranked the U.S. as a flawed democracy and no longer a full democracy. In this sense, I had an interesting event. Living in Switzerland, my doctor was Swiss, but he was of Romanian background. He'd grown up in Romania. This was the time of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And he'd just been talking to his sister who lived in Cleveland. He turned to me and said, look, Your RFE broadcasts to Romania during the Cold War were great. Everybody listened to them. But now we need an RFE broadcasting to the United States. I couldn't disagree with him on that point, unfortunately. Now, I get to the uncertain future here. And there's a major change for U.S. government media, which was included as a late addition to the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act. It received no congressional debate. It was put in at the last minute, and of course the military budget had to be voted, so this just went along with it. But what it does, and I talked about the structure earlier on, this mandates a new organizational structure for U.S. media with a presidentially appointed CEO with full power to directly appoint broadcast network heads. This may allow greater partisan political influence. This was never early a significant role for the radios. They were never a partisan issue. They had always bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle. In fact, during that period when there was some question about the status of the radio, I'm going back a little bit earlier into the early 70s when they were put under the Board for International Broadcasting, it was Senator Humphrey from Minnesota who played a major role in preserving the radios. The board, which has existed to provide a firewall. The firewall is supposed to keep both governmental and political influence out of them. In other words, the State Department can't tell you what to say. People in Congress can't tell you what to say. You are responsible for best journalistic practice, and that's it. They're no longer charged with oversight, nor will they probably have that effectiveness as a firewall against political influence. This is contrary to the spirit of all previous legislation, which insisted on the editorial independence of the surrogate grantees and a strong firewall against governmental or political interference. Can, at this point, an alternative to this creeping federalization of the grantees, and the grantees were all the stations, all the networks except Voice of America, still be brought about? There is some hope that with the change in the construction of the House, there might be a possibility to reopen this issue and to amend the 2017 National Defense Act that dealt with the radios. I don't know if that's going to be possible. One proposal that's out there is to merge all of these surrogate grantees, those four that I talked about, under a non-governmental self-replenishing board, such as the National Endowment for Democracy or the U.S. Institute of Peace, where it would be funded by Congress, subjected to general oversight, but with independent governance and operations. We'll have to see if something like that is possible. If it's not, I have very serious concerns as to what might happen in the future under this legislation. It hasn't taken effect yet. It will not take effect until the person who has been nominated by the administration, whose name is before the Senate right now, has been confirmed. Once he is confirmed, however, the situation will automatically change and this new structure will be in place, and we can look forward to a possible politicization of these entities, which have been built up over the years at considerable expense, but even more so in terms of how they have built up their credibility over the years. As I said before, credibility it's hard to get, it's easy to lose. There's a growing foreign response. There's a foreign response to growing U.S. nationalism. Getting back into the theme of the fall talks, growing negative and critical attitudes toward U.S. policy in many parts of the world is a new American nationalism and its inherent neo-isolationism that promotes America first, a threat to U.S. credibility and attractiveness abroad. Is this a new idea of America? And is it consistent with the historical mission of U.S. broadcasting or the notion of, I don't like the term, but I'll use it here, American exceptionalism as a beacon of democracy to the world? The President's UN speech of on America First, which is actually America alone, is foreboding. Despite administration's claims, U.S. standing in the world is not higher now, but lower, except in Russia and Brazil. Good company. There are now many calls by many to make U.S. broadcasting more relevant. by tying it more directly to promoting U.S. strategic interests as part of quote-unquote information warfare? Is weaponizing what we've seen happen with Russia, U.S. media in response to Russia and other approaches, a formula for success or failure? Past experience indicates it would probably be a failure, as U.S. global media will tend to lose credibility with its audiences. Again, it's difficult for U.S. global media to compete aggressively in a weaponized manner and still remain consistent with mission statements, ethos, and best journalistic practices. Need also to be wary of calls by some for U.S. global media to engage more directly in so-called sharp power. This is a new term that Joe Nye has added to his former definition of soft power. Nye's addition to soft power, the sharp power, is the ability to insert the cyberknife stealthily and surgically. The authoritarian use of soft power, referring to, by example to Russia, is not principally about attraction or even persuasion. It rather centers on distraction and manipulation. Sharp power pierces, penetrates, or perforates the political and information environments in targeted countries. Russia and China have raised barriers to external political and cultural influence at home, while simultaneously taking advantage of the openness of democratic systems abroad. In this context, it is necessary to reaffirm support for democratic values and ideals and journalistic integrity and best practice. Despite some advocates, my feeling is that U.S. global media is not the place for a sharp power approach, which would damage its hard-won credibility. As I said before, hard to get, easy to lose. In closing, a few questions. Are we as a nation willing to provide the resources and the organizational structure required to continue to be a major player in the global media environment? Can a badly divided U.S. speak effectively to the rest of the world with a coherent voice, and will it be heard and accepted? Or will it be drowned out or discredited by the cacophony of our internal divisions and a new America First nationalism? It would be easy to be pessimistic about the situation. I'd like to quote fellow Minnesotan Tom Friedman, columnist for the New York Times, speaking at one of my alma maters, the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins, had an amusing anecdote, more pertinent than amusing actually, on the false dichotomy of optimism and pessimism. He used the word optimist as a subtitle for his recent book, Pardon Me for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Something. And he thought about this, and he found a rabbi friend in Amsterdam and asked him about this. And the rabbi friend rejected both optimism and pessimism as fatalisms. If you're an optimist, you've always got to be optimistic. If you're a pessimist, you've always got to be negative. And he argued instead for, quote unquote, applied hope. I share that view. Thank you.
So raise your hands if you're interested in posing a question, and we'll get a mic to you. Would you like to call on people, Gene?
Yes, okay, fine. The first one there. Yes, you.
Our generation right now is, maybe it's naive to see it as a new problem, but we see a problem rising of independent media operating in a capitalist competitive environment, nonetheless provoking misinformation and violence. We could talk about the Facebook provoking anti-Muslim violence. Sri Lanka, was it the People's Radio in Rwanda, in the Rwanda genocide, as well as
Radio Mil Colleen, 1,000 Hills, yeah.
Exactly. As well as the white supremacists and isolationist nationalists within the U.S., all of which operate as private agents within the capitalist environment, nonetheless spreading false information and somewhat fighting against the idea of best propaganda is no propaganda. So, speaking of uncertain future, what could we do and what maybe the government, the society do to fight
Yeah.
against this new problem?
I know that my argument sounds a little bit old-fashioned and somewhat weak in this, arguing for trying to build credibility, observe good journalistic practice. I'll admit to being at least partially optimistic in thinking that at some point a respect and a hunger for truth and factual information will return, that people will become sick and tired of this fake news and incitement. There isn't a real easy answer to the question that you raised. I wish I had one. There are lots of examples of that going on, and it is a part of the entire media situation that's out there. I realize that I'm a bit of a voice crying in the wilderness, arguing for an old-fashioned approach but I don't think we have any choice but to try to stick with that. This whole argument about becoming more relevant, sharper. There's a word for that now in Washington too. It's called strategic communication, and that is taking a sharper position on things, and it goes beyond journalism, and it does get into areas that I would associate with propaganda. Others might not. But I think this does not belong in the U.S. global media environment. It belongs in the Pentagon. This is where they do this sort of thing, and but it's not journalism, and it shouldn't be confused with it. Sorry, I couldn't give you the kind of answer I'm sure you would have liked to have had, but I think you know too that there really isn't an easy answer to that.
I guess.
Right behind you there was a question? No, okay.
I don't necessarily know how to phrase this, but kind of in the modern day geopolitical sphere of, I guess what I'm thinking of more, both the Eastern European and Balkan regions. From my own experience, I've noticed it's less totalitarian and more corruption based, and a lot, especially for me, the Balkan republics in the Balkan states. Would you see that? And there's open acknowledgement of corruption in higher offices, but I don't know if it's complacency or just pessimism of the populace. But would you see that as a harder foe to kind of infiltrate, and with, be it American or Western or just democratic soft power, or do you think that a different strategy needs to be applied to those areas?
This is going to be a very difficult issue to tackle from the outside, because these are issues that are endemic to the societies themselves. It's one of the great disappointments, of course, is that none of these countries completely turned out the way one would have hoped. Perhaps it was naive to hope that way. I know our own research in the transition period in the early 90s did show these ideas that we want to do it our way. We don't want a Western model imposed on us. We want a Russian model or a Polish model. This question of the Polish model is coming very much out too. There they ran against corruption, but they ran on nationalism, trying to use nationalism against corruption. I don't know how corruption is going to be rooted out of these societies. It existed under the communist regimes in somewhat different forms. It was transformed into the post-communist regimes. It's not an issue that's going to be settled from the outside. But you raise another point, and I meant to address this, and I didn't. And it has to do, when you're talking about the Balkans, the Serbs, Croats, Russians against everybody else, the Poles. One of the things that the radios were doing was to try to tamper down these hostilities between the different nations, between the Russians and their and the minorities of the Soviet Union, between Serbs and Croats, and so on and so forth. In that sense, they were very much in an evolutionary mode and trying not to not to stir up trouble, but to tamp it down. That was a little off from what you said, but
Yeah.
you reminded me of a topic that was an important one.
Thank you.
With the more recent movements from several Western European nations, particularly France and Germany, towards becoming, in essence, a representative of liberal values, democracy, freedom of speech, and human rights in the absence of the United States in that area, do you feel that these nations have shown an inclination for or a potential to take up the mantle of United States global media influence?
It's an interesting question. I certainly welcome what they're doing. I think it's necessary what they're doing. They don't have the heft that the United States has, and that's the problem. The world still looks to the United States, its position, 325 million people, its huge military presence around the world as the main game in town. And what the Germans and the French are doing, Merkel and Macron, and I think Macron was absolutely correct when he says that nationalism is the opposite, is the enemy of patriotism. I think what they're saying is important. I think it needs to be listened to, but I don't think it can replace a robust pro-democratic presence of the United States, and we seem to be leaving the field open on that one.
You speak of the championing of democratic values and human rights by these organizations sponsored by the United States, and especially with this current administration, with the absence of that coming from the highest level, I'm sure it becomes even more important. And the answer to this question might change fundamentally once the radio in itself has been politicized, as you put it. But
the danger of them being politicized,
yeah.
It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
Right now it's business as usual.
Mm-hmm. In the absence of leadership coming from the very top of the United States, has the radio been able to champion new rights like those of women, those of the LGBT community, especially in countries that are so averse to those groups, like Russia, like in Eastern Europe?
Yes. The short answer to that is yes, they have. They've been very active in those areas.
Thank you.
One of the challenges for journalistic integrity for many commercial organizations has been a dwindling income stream related to advertising being taken over by other organizations. Do you have any comments about this?
That's you're putting this into a domestic context now. Yes, it's a real problem. They're compensating for this by increasing their digital subscriptions. I'm looking at two newspapers that I read on a daily basis, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they have in fact increased their reach considerably on their digital platforms. Whether this is compensating for the loss of hard copy advertising, I really don't know. But they have vastly increased their reach and their readership, and I think I don't see any reason why that should why that should stop. I've watched the Washington Post over the last several years, especially since Bezos took it over, and the money he's put into it. Of course, this isn't necessarily made up by advertising, but he's been trying to turn it into an absolutely first-rate newspaper with a lot of new hires. So it's not all a downward spiral. I think this problem is going to be more felt is not necessarily in the top 2, 3, 4 newspapers in the country, but in your medium-sized press across the country that cannot expand its reach digitally and get information that way. So what you're going to see happening, I think, is a smaller number of media outlets becoming national and which really hasn't been the case up to this point. But yes, I do think there's a real problem for the local and medium-sized press across the country. I think it's going to largely disappear. And having come out of that sort of a background myself, I find this a very sad turn of events.
Oftentimes, the talking heads on TV refer to the media. How do you define, in this day and age, given the presence of the web, but still print, broadcast, and everything that we used to know as media, how do you define the modern day media?
Now that is a very interesting question. I would talk about the media in a more or less classic sense and put social media over here as something else. I'd say that there are really two different types of media out there, and one has to distinguish between the two. And I see social media as being quite different from the traditional media. So I don't think there's one simple word that does justice to the complexity of the situation. At least I can't come up with one off the top of my head right now.
So you talked about the situation with the USSR, or Soviet Russia, with the radio and stuff, you know.
Yeah.
This country doesn't, or I mean, like, my generation doesn't listen to the radio that much for news, NPR, things like that. I mean, every once in a while. And I think the situation here could probably benefit a lot from some sort of free radio. And it probably wouldn't be literal radio, but what do you think would be a good outlet, a good way of, like, unpartisan, not biased media news for this country?
Well, you already do have NPR. I'm a strong supporter of NPR, and I wish we had more of it. I also like very much the BBC, both BBC Radio and BBC TV. Not BBC America, which is an entertainment channel, but BBC World News. And one has to make a distinction between their entertainment channel, which I don't see as being that much different from any American entertainment channel, and BBC World Service Radio, which is excellent, and BBC World TV News, which I don't think is as good as it once was, but is still better than just about anything else around, in my view.
Mr. Parta, thanks for the very insightful presentation on media, and I actually now understand the political value of media. So you opened up with a story about, you mentioned Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes.
Unfortunately, was murdered by folks close to the Saudi regime. And you also mentioned couples of instances of repression perpetrated by government towards employees of the
Yes.
RFL. I was wondering, I'm interested in actually understanding the sources of territorial and extraterritorial repression towards opposition members by dictators. Specifically, it seems like, would it be fair to assume that in places where the media personnel become the targets of repression, government repression, in those places the media actually produces hard-hitting reports, as opposed to places where there's less harassment, and then maybe in those places the reporters are less critical of the government. So at least one country that I know best, Tajikistan, the media, the RFL employees developed a reputation for being government loyalists. Kind of they lost their impartial and oppositional, reputation. So I guess, do you have any data on that? Maybe in your studies, did you collect data on?
No, I don't have any data on that, but I recognize the point you make. And that is, once you are granted legitimacy to operate within the country, will you tone down your
Right.
messaging a bit just so you can maintain your presence there.
Right, to stay in
And you can
business.
rationalize that saying, well, if I really dealt in a very hard and forthright fashion with this, I'd be kicked out of the country, and then I couldn't really do much of anything. Yes, I think there is a danger. I think I think there was a big discussion within RL, especially when they were able to get bureaus inside the former Soviet Union. How was this going to impact the way they reported on it? And I think there was a certain tension between Russian staff members in Prague and in Moscow, precisely on that issue. There was a feeling that Moscow was adapting a little bit too much to the environment, and too much to wanting to make sure that we can stay there and function there on the ground. This is an ongoing issue. There are trade-offs. When you're on the ground, you're able to do things that you're not able to do from the outside. But by the same token, how much do you have to temper your message to be able to maintain that presence? I'm not specifically aware of what you say about Tajikistan, but it doesn't surprise me. And two, at the same time, there are those who always want a sharper message. They are just very oppositional by character, and unless you're going for the jugular all the time, you're going to disappoint them. At what point does just good journalism that you're able to do inside the country offset that other? And these are trade-offs, and they're editorial decisions that have to be made all the time when you're dealing with that issue.
Thank you.
First, I want to express appreciation for, among other things, your reaching out to previous lectures or part of our program. In a couple of moments, I did get the sense that you were differentiating your own view of such matters from the position of Walter Russell Mead. It's interesting that Mead, just last week in Wall Street Journal, published an article criticizing Macron on this, for the same matter that you are praising
I
him.
hadn't seen that.
He is also one who has argued generally that what you have in the history of American foreign policy is a debate among a number of different positions, the Wilsonian position, but then the Jacksonian position has its moment, it's not inferior, et cetera, and so forth. I hear you saying in some sense that he might be wrong with that kind of accentuation, and that you prefer the Wilsonian approach to things. Did I hear you right?
I could be a critic of the Wilsonian position too, as being perhaps overly idealistic and at times naive. No, I was just trying to typify what I saw as the radio's ethos was in that Wilsonian paradigm. And no, I'm not critical of Mead's position on
just to
Jacksonian.
follow up on the point he made in the Wall Street Journal articles, he said that Macron was reflective of a certain kind of European bureaucratic elitism in the critique of nationalism. You hear this kind of argument quite often. And another argument that you hear related to this, in fact, it's an argument that's going to be made next spring. One of our guests, a guy named Frank Furedi, that the critique of nationalism is, at least implicitly, at least in certain moments, a critique of local democracy. I'm wondering how you would respond. I think that in some measure Mead's article was sort of pushing that line implicitly as a criticism of Macron. So I was just wondering how you would react to any number of those claims.
Yeah, I haven't seen the Mead article, but I'll certainly take a look at it. No, I wasn't being critical of Mead so much as trying to set what I saw as the radio's ethos and fitting to a Wilsonian paradigm as being different from a Jacksonian paradigm. As I said, I can certainly support some aspects of the Wilsonian paradigm, but I don't think I would carry it to an extreme at all. It was more a way to typify what I saw it and how it differs from the others, the Hamiltonian or the Jacksonian. I think one has to sort of separate the Wilsonian paradigm here from the success of his presidency. The values that were expressed in it from how it didn't play out that well in historical terms. Well. Thank you very much.